Thunder rolled ominously from the horizon, while jagged flashes of lightning tore through the inky darkness above. Sophie wrapped her slender coat more snugly around herself as she disembarked from the creaky bus, her boots sinking into the damp, mud-laden earth. The air was infused with the nostalgic aroma of damp grass and a biting wind, a scent that stirred her memories with a bittersweet ache. Yet, that feeling of nostalgia proved fleeting. A ghostly chill slithered up her spine, imbuing her with an eerie sense of unease. There was an unsettling feeling in the air. It was not the environment that influenced her, but rather an inner force. Or perhaps something even more unsettling about this place. The wooden farmhouse rested quietly amid the sprawling fields, its porch light emitting a soft yellow glow that struggled to penetrate the enveloping darkness. Caleb stood there, casually leaning against the porch post, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. His lips remained uncurled. His gaze, quiet yet intense, fixed on Sophie as though he had been anticipating her arrival for an eternity. There was an unsettling quality in his stance, in the manner the wind danced with his loose shirt, that stirred something within her. "Aunt Sophie," Caleb greeted, his voice deep and rough, echoing like the breeze rustling through the fields. "At last, you have arrived." Sophie inclined her head, making her way toward him with deliberate slowness. "Indeed. I have arrived." She endeavored to maintain a steady tone, yet the unease that tugged at her words remained unmistakable. Caleb remained still. He observed her intently, his gaze tracing each delicate motion she executed, each inhalation she drew, as if attempting to unravel the mystery she held within. As Sophie stepped onto the porch, an unusual sight caught her eye. A ribbon of crimson snaked from the doorway, vanishing into the shadowy depths of the home. It may not have been substantial enough to incite panic, yet it undeniably captured her focus. Crimson liquid. Color? She found herself in a state of uncertainty. "What is this?" she inquired, gesturing toward the streak. Caleb cast his gaze downward, his demeanor remaining steadfast. "A wounded coyote stumbled in last night," he remarked nonchalantly. Yet, there was an element in his tone that sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. "I intended to tidy it up. I was not anticipating your arrival at such an early hour." His response did little to alleviate Sophie's discomfort. She cast her gaze once more at the crimson mark, which faded into the lurking shadows of the house. As she crossed the threshold, an unnameable heaviness settled upon her chest. The soft, golden glow from the living room lamp struggled to dispel the unsettling chill that lingered in the air. A chair, once poised near the fireplace, now lay askew, while an open book rested on the table, its pages tattered and crumpled, whispering tales of neglect. A gentle breeze wafted through the slightly ajar window, making the curtains dance softly in its embrace. "Do you recall a farm resembling this?" Caleb's voice emerged from behind her, steady and inquisitive, as though gauging her response. Sophie pivoted to confront him, her eyes locking onto his, revealing depths she had never encountered in him previously. The eyes that gazed back at her were not those of the boy she had once known. They were keen, cutting, and imbued with an unsettling essence that stirred her discomfort. "You've changed," Sophie replied, attempting to redirect both his gaze and her own disquieting emotions. Yet, beneath the surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that this return was far from the vision she had conjured in her mind. Caleb's gaze, unwavering and probing, appeared to convey an unvoiced message, a secret she was not ready to confront. "Everything's changed," Caleb murmured, his voice a mere whisper. His words hung in the atmosphere, thick with meaning, prompting Sophie to question whether her discomfort stemmed from him or from within herself. Regardless, she understood that this return would be anything but the tranquil refuge she had envisioned. Sophie lingered in the quaint kitchen, the faint glow from the vintage hanging lamp creating gentle shadows that danced upon the time-worn wooden walls. The delicate aroma of bread hung in the atmosphere, echoes of the morning, evoking memories of a life that had slipped away. She extended her hand, allowing her fingers to lightly touch the polished surface of the wooden counter, the exact place where her grandmother once kneaded dough for the family's meals. Each scratch, each crack in the wood appeared to murmur tales from yesteryears, evoking memories of the uncomplicated, joyful days she had once known. In her childhood, Sophie dashed barefoot through the boundless fields, her joyous laughter mingling with her grandmother's gentle chuckles drifting from the porch. The summers spent at the farm were undeniably the most enchanting moments of her existence, each day brimming with limitless freedom and a blissful disregard for the future. Yet, as she matured, her world transformed, engulfed by the tumult and demands of urban existence. She entered into marriage, convinced she had discovered a new family and a fresh start, only to come to the painful realization years later that she had lost her essence in the midst of obligations and a love that had faded into monotony. The memories gripped her heart, rendering her breathless. Sophie averted her gaze, seeking refuge from the haunting images that looped relentlessly in her thoughts. Then Caleb stepped into the kitchen, his presence both subtle and weighty. He placed a bucket of water on the floor, the splashing droplets creating delicate streaks on the wooden boards. "Do you still recall this place?" he inquired, his tone steady yet inquisitive, his gaze locked onto her, as if he were unraveling the very fabric of her mind. "Of course," Sophie replied, her voice scarcely rising above a whisper, almost lost in the gentle murmur of the wind rustling beyond the window. "This place once held all the significance in my life." She endeavored to maintain a steady, impartial tone, yet Caleb appeared to sense an undercurrent, a silent resonance woven into her words. He offered a subtle nod, yet remained silent thereafter. Caleb had always been that way, reserved and thoughtful, each word he selected carrying a significant gravity. Sophie's mind wandered back to the last occasion she had found herself in this place, a summer etched in her memory from the time she was merely 20. In those days, the farm stood as a refuge, a realm overflowing with promise and rejuvenation. Yet now, it seemed transformed. It had transformed from a sanctuary of solace into a guardian of mysteries, holding not just the whispers of the dwelling and its inhabitants, but her own hidden truths too. Caleb reached to clean the water from the floor, yet his eyes flickered to her intermittently, each glance both quick and intentional. The gaze, imbued with a silent fervor, set her on edge. "For how long have you found yourself in this place?" Sophie inquired abruptly, her words slipping out as she sought to shatter the oppressive quietude. 10 years, Caleb replied, his gaze fixed elsewhere. "Yet, I suppose that knowledge eludes you, doesn't it?" His tone carried no accusation, yet it lacked a gentle touch as well. It was straightforward, cutting in its directness. A sharp twinge of remorse ignited within Sophie's heart. Indeed, it was true. She had never truly inquired about Caleb. He had consistently occupied a marginal role in the fragmented dialogue she shared with her aunt. Sophie admitted, studying Caleb with a cautious gaze, "You've changed a lot. I recall you as a timid little boy, perpetually seeking refuge behind your mother." Caleb emitted a brief, humorless chuckle. "One cannot remain a child indefinitely, can one?" He straightened, his gaze becoming suddenly sharper, more piercing. "Nor can you. Sophie, you've transformed as well. not merely on the surface. Within as well. The words struck Sophie with the sharpness of a blade. They surpassed the accuracy of anything she had ever encountered. Yet, how was it that he could perceive her so clearly? How could Caleb, a figure she scarcely recognized, grasp the deep fissures that lay within her soul? Sophie remained silent. She remained rooted in place, exposed and vulnerable beneath the intensity of his stare, unable to conceal her true self. Caleb took a step back, yet his gaze remained firmly locked on hers. "You believe this farm remains unchanged, but it has transformed," he murmured, his tone heavy with unexpressed emotions. "It has transformed in ways you may not fully comprehend." A chill coursed through Sophie, and it wasn't merely the draft wafting in from the window. Caleb's words carried a heavy significance, a subtle caution woven into their fabric. His statement held an elusive quality, a hidden depth, a secret yearning to be discovered. Sophie found herself at a crossroads, uncertain whether she truly wished to unveil the mystery or if she possessed the fortitude to face it. Yet, beneath the surface, she was aware of one undeniable truth. This return to the farm would prove to be anything but the serene retreat she had envisioned. That morning, soft sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, yet it failed to warm the cool tension that hung in the air between Sophie and Caleb. They had become familiar with this peculiar stillness, a taut hush that neither dared to disrupt. Sophie immersed herself in the morning ritual of breakfast, her hands deftly maneuvering a sizzling pan, yet her thoughts spiraled in restless circles, burdened by the unvoiced intensity of Caleb's gaze lingering just behind her. "Is there anything you require? Allow me to assist you." Caleb's rich, resonant voice shattered the stillness, causing Sophie to startle as if she had been discovered in the midst of a secretive endeavor. She pivoted to confront him, locking onto his gaze, intense and piercing, brimming with an elusive emotion that eluded her understanding. Sophie shook her head, striving for an air of composure, yet her fingers quivered as she placed the pan down. "No. I've got it," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb chose not to delve deeper. He strolled to the sink, activated the faucet, and commenced the ritual of washing his hands. The seemingly mundane gesture resonated with an unspoken intensity, as if it bore a significance that eluded their understanding. They were near enough that Sophie could sense the warmth emanating from him, hear the steady cadence of his breath beside her. It was overwhelming. She stepped back, withdrawing as if his presence were a flame she dared not approach for fear of the burn. That afternoon, they toiled side by side in the fields, attending to the towering grass that awaited its timely harvest before the chill of winter arrived. Sophie donned a weathered straw hat, her gaze fixed with unwavering intensity on her tasks, resolute in her effort to remain absorbed and diverted. Still, despite her best efforts, she found it impossible to shake off the heavy presence of Caleb's stare lingering on her from the other side of the field. He moved with a serene grace, each action deliberate and exact, yet whenever Sophie looked up, their gazes intertwined. Caleb maintained his gaze, unwavering. He locked eyes with her, his demeanor resolute, as though challenging her to confront the silent electricity that pulsed in the space between them. As the afternoon waned and the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the fields with strokes of golden light, Sophie found herself feeling completely exhausted. She settled into the cool embrace of a sprawling oak, brushing the perspiration from her forehead. Caleb drew near, a bottle of water clasped in his hand. "You look tired," he remarked, setting the bottle down beside her. Sophie accepted it with gratitude, taking a delicate sip, yet her gaze remained fixed on him. Caleb settled beside her, positioned just within reach, allowing her to catch the subtle sheen of sweat glistening on his neck. "Have you ever considered making this place your permanent home?" Caleb inquired abruptly, his tone soft yet heavy with significance. Sophie gazed at him, taken aback by the inquiry. She confessed that she hadn't. "I merely required a respite." Caleb nodded, yet his gaze remained steadfastly locked onto hers. "This location. It's different from what you recall. And so am I," he murmured softly. His words carried an edge, revealing a deeper layer that Sophie found impossible to overlook. Her heart raced, yet she remained silent. They lingered in quietude beneath the oak tree, the sole sound being the gentle whisper of the wind weaving through the grass. Sophie's thoughts swirled within her, a tempest of emotions that resonated with both familiarity and fear. She attempted to convince herself that it was merely the fatigue, the wistfulness of returning to the farm. Yet Caleb's gaze, those eyes that appeared to penetrate every barrier she had constructed, told a different story. As the evening unfolded, they found themselves side by side on the front porch, beneath a sky adorned with stars that sparkled like an expansive, radiant tapestry. Sophie cradled a steaming cup of tea, her attention drawn to the gentle serenade of crickets and the refreshing caress of the night air. Yet, with Caleb beside her, every sense was amplified, leaving her acutely aware of the proximity between them. Suddenly, Caleb shattered the stillness. "Aunt Sophie," he started, his tone soft yet resolute. "Have you ever experienced? Is there a sense of solitude lingering in the air?" Sophie was taken aback by the question. She turned to face him, locking her gaze with his, which now held a deeper darkness, devoid of their customary tranquility. Sophie paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She understood that the question held a significance beyond its mere phrasing, and in that brief instant, she sensed every wall she had erected between them begin to fall away. "Indeed," she confessed gently, her tone unwavering yet tinged with vulnerability, "I have experienced loneliness for quite some time." Caleb's gaze softened, and for the first time, Sophie glimpsed a reflection of her own emotions in his eyes. A quiet, aching vulnerability. "Me too," he confessed, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "However, ever since your return, my feelings have shifted." His words lingered in the space that separated them, fragile yet resolute, an unseen tether drawing Sophie nearer to him. She yearned to utter a word, any word, to shatter the palpable tension, yet Caleb's gaze anchored her, holding her captive in that fleeting instant. In that fleeting moment, Sophie understood that all boundaries separating them had faded, every barrier between them had crumbled away. The emotions she harbored deep within her were no longer mere flickers of uncertainty. They had transformed into something unmistakable and resolute. They instilled a fear in her unlike anything she had ever experienced. The air within the house thickened after that evening, a palpable tension settling between Sophie and Caleb, both acutely aware that something had changed, yet neither willing to confront it. Sophie reassured herself that all would eventually fade if she upheld her distance, if she turned a blind eye to the lingering glances and the subtle words that Caleb directed towards her. Yet, with each vow she made to steer clear of him, Caleb materialized, an inescapable shadow lingering at the edges of her resolve. On that day, the sky loomed heavy and gray, while the wind roared through the fields, bearing the foreboding promise of an impending storm. Sophie devoted her morning to tidying the house, seeking to occupy herself and fend off the tempest of thoughts swirling within her mind. As the afternoon sun cast its warm glow, she emerged onto the porch to gather the laundry, her gaze catching sight of Caleb in the distance, approaching the house with determined, brisk steps. His shirt bore the marks of mud, and he gripped something firmly in his hand. Sophie stood still, her gaze locked onto him, a strange discomfort settling deep within her chest. "What is happening?" she inquired as Caleb ascended the steps to the porch, his expression tight with unease. Caleb hesitated before responding. Instead, he offered her a wrinkled piece of paper, his face a mask of inscrutability. Sophie unfolded it, and her heart appeared to freeze as she absorbed the hastily written words. "They are aware." Merely 2 words, yet they bore a heaviness that enveloped her like a dense, overcast sky. Sophie gazed up at Caleb, her eyes brimming with alarm. "What is the significance of this?" she inquired, her voice quivering with emotion. Caleb shook his head, yet a spark of icy resolve ignited in his eyes. "I'm uncertain, yet it's evident that someone witnessed something." A shiver coursed through Sophie's spine. Her thoughts drifted to Eleanor, her keen-eyed companion who had graced the farm with her presence just days prior. Eleanor had always possessed an uncanny insight, a quality that left Sophie feeling uneasy. She couldn't dispel the nagging thought that Eleanor might have caught on to the way Caleb's gaze lingered on her. Yet, was Eleanor genuinely the author of the note? Or could it have been another individual? Sophie remained unaware, yet the identity of the author seemed to fade into insignificance. The crucial reality was that their secret had slipped from the shadows, no longer secure. Caleb moved nearer, his eyes piercing through her with a sharp intensity. "Aunt Sophie, regardless of the author, there is one truth I hold dear. We can no longer maintain the facade that nothing has transpired." His voice held a calm assurance, tinged with an unspoken urgency, as though he were poised for Sophie to finally acknowledge the truth they both understood deep down. Sophie instinctively stepped back, yet Caleb was determined not to let her escape. He advanced, narrowing the gap that separated them, his demeanor as steadfast as his speech. "Do you not sense it?" he urged, his tone gentle yet unwavering. "Each time I gaze upon you, I am acutely aware that we are deceiving ourselves." "Absolutely not, Caleb." "It's not like that," Sophie whispered, yet her tone betrayed a lack of certainty. Caleb's lips twisted into a sardonic grin. "You may deceive me, but the truth remains with you." Sophie spun around abruptly, attempting to escape into the house, but Caleb seized her wrist, his grip igniting a spark within her. "You can't keep running away, Sophie," he said, his voice laced with urgency, almost a plea. "It is essential that we discuss this matter. If we fail to act, the situation will inevitably deteriorate." Sophie tore her hand away, her gaze filled with turmoil. "Caleb, this feels all wrong. We are united as one family. Are you not grasping that? Kin?" Caleb's voice resonated with a blend of disbelief and frustration. "You wield that term to rationalize it all. Yet deep down, we both understand that we are not family, Sophie. We have never been." His words pierced her, slicing through the last remnants of her defenses. He was indeed correct. Their connection had never mirrored the familial bond that others often presumed it to be. Yet, acknowledging that truth required confronting the reality she had struggled so fiercely to reject, a reality that loomed too heavy to endure. The wind outside roared with increasing ferocity, shaking the windows as if the tempest aimed to rip the very structure from its foundations. Sophie glanced back at Caleb, a sense of her whole universe crumbling beneath her feet. "This is not something we can pursue, Caleb. I am unable to do that." Her voice quivered, laden with the heaviness of her feelings. Yet Caleb moved nearer. His gaze ignited with a fervor she had never witnessed until now. "I don't need you to say anything," Caleb murmured, his voice a low, steady whisper. "All I ask is that you heed the whispers of your heart. This has been overlooked for far too long, Sophie. Yet now, it is unmistakably evident. Returning is not an option for me. And deep within, I understand that you cannot either." His words laid Sophie open, offering her no refuge. She remained motionless in the small, dimly lit room, the storm outside reflecting the turmoil swirling inside her. In that instant, Sophie came to understand the profound truth behind Caleb's words. This extended beyond his own narrative. It centered on her, on the long-buried desires and fears that had lingered in the shadows of her heart. A decision loomed, one that would alter the course of everything for eternity. The wooden house succumbed to an unsettling silence following their dispute. Caleb erupted from the room, the door crashing shut behind him with a violence that made Sophie sense the very walls of the house tremble in response. She remained motionless in the living room, her gaze locked on the door that had just shut behind him. The world around her dissolved into obscurity, leaving behind the suffocating heaviness that pressed upon her heart. Outside, the wind wailed through the fissures in the doorframe, bearing the foreboding hint of a looming tempest. Yet inside Sophie, a tempest had been brewing for much longer. She strolled deliberately to the window, peering through the misty pane. Caleb lingered on the porch, fingers wrapped around the weathered railing. His gaze fixed on the expansive void of the fields before him. His posture was unyielding, determined, yet Sophie sensed the inner chaos brewing within him, mirroring her own feelings. She longed to step outside and utter words that might span the vast divide between them, yet her legs seemed anchored to the earth, immobilized by the weight of what had transpired. She understood they had crossed a line, and yet she was acutely aware that retreat was no longer an option. Each word uttered, each lingering gaze, each ephemeral moment exchanged between them. Each fragment lay before her, a puzzle she dared not assemble. Sophie had woven a tapestry of self-deception, believing it to be a mere misunderstanding, a fleeting illusion. Yet now, the truth lay exposed before her, stark and inescapable. The abrupt knock at the door pierced the heavy silence, causing Sophie to jump in surprise. She spun around, her heart constricting at the sound of Eleanor's voice drifting from the other side. "Sophie, are you there?" Sophie hurried to unlock the door, striving to steady her breath and conceal the tempest of emotions churning inside her. Eleanor entered, her keen gaze sweeping across the room, pausing momentarily on Sophie before shifting to the porch where Caleb remained stationed. Her silence was profound, yet the tension in her furrowed brows conveyed a depth of emotion that words could never capture. She sensed that something was amiss. Eleanor grasped Sophie by the arm and guided her into the kitchen, her voice a hushed yet resolute whisper. "For how much longer will you allow this to continue? It's clear that concealment is not a lasting solution." Sophie experienced the piercing sensation of a dagger thrust deep into her chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, striving for composure, yet her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. Eleanor regarded her with an intense gaze, her eyes sharp and unyielding like polished metal. "Sophie, you understand precisely what I mean. I observe the gaze Caleb casts upon you, and the way your eyes meet his in return." The words hit Sophie with the force of a slap. She longed to refute it, to proclaim that Eleanor was mistaken, yet the truth bore down on her with such gravity that no facade could be maintained. "I don't know what to do," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling as tears began to pool in her eyes. I can no longer remain in this place. Yet, I cannot depart without confronting this matter. Eleanor clasped Sophie's hands, holding them firmly as if she were channeling her own strength into her. Sophie, it's time to come to a conclusion. Not solely for your own sake, but for Caleb's as well. He cannot remain in this state of uncertainty. It is unjust. That night, Sophie found herself wide awake, her gaze fixed on the shadowy ceiling while the wind wailed outside, its sorrowful sounds intertwining with the chaos swirling within her thoughts. Time and again, she envisioned Caleb on the porch, his gaze a tumultuous blend of anguish and yearning that kept her in a state of unrest. She understood her course of action, yet facing the truth seemed akin to chiseling away a fragment of her very being. As dawn broke, casting its golden light over the fields, Sophie lingered by the front door, her weathered suitcase resting at her feet. Caleb stood just a few paces away, his eyes rimmed with red and devoid of life, as if sleep had eluded him entirely. So, you're truly departing. His voice carried a roughness, lacking in fury yet laden with deep sadness. It was not a challenge to her decision. Rather, it was a heartfelt request for understanding. Every word seemed to bear an insufferable burden. Sophie nodded, her fingers tightly clutching the handle of her suitcase. I must, Caleb. Not out of desire, but due to the impossibility of continuing in this manner. We both must embrace our own lives. Caleb moved in, his gaze filled with desperation. You fail to grasp the situation. All I desire is you. We are capable of. Sophie lifted a hand, interrupting him. Absolutely not, Caleb. It is not possible for us to do so. It's not that I lack concern for you. Rather, it's the realization that this path will lead to our mutual ruin. Some boundaries are sacred, and we have ventured perilously near to them. She pivoted to depart, each step burdened by the gravity of her utterances. Yet, just as she approached the car, Caleb's voice emerged, low yet brimming with unfiltered emotion. Aunt Sophie, your memory will forever remain etched in my heart. Sophie hesitated, her breath catching in her throat, yet she refused to glance back. A solitary tear traced a path down her cheek as she settled into the car, departing from Caleb, his silhouette gradually dissolving into the distance as the vehicle pulled away from the farm. With a final glance over her shoulder, Sophie caught sight of Caleb, rooted in place, his eyes locked onto her as if he were attempting to carve her likeness into his mind for eternity. Despite the deep ache in her heart that loomed like a shadow, Sophie understood that her choice was the right one. For in certain moments, love transcends the act of clinging. It reveals itself in the grace of release. As the fields unfurled beneath the radiant morning sun, Sophie murmured a quiet wish that both she and Caleb might discover solace, even if it meant being separated.